Hi, this is your host Sapil Bhartia. The Linux Foundation recently published Pathways to Open Data, a report summarizing its challenge session at the World Open Innovation Conference, which was organized last November. In this session, participants discussed the unique challenges of opening up data, whether and how they use open data, and what are some of the avenues for greater openness. This report summarizes these findings in the context of the history of open data and in light of AI's growing need for data. And to discuss this report, we have with us once again Anna Hermansen, researcher and ecosystem manager at the Linux Foundation. Anna, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Before we deep dive into some of the findings of the report, let's just give us the genesis of this report, Linux Foundation's involvement with the World Open Innovation Conference.
One of our advisors on our research advisory board, Henry Chesbrough, he works with the World Open Innovation Community, and they host a conference every year. And this past year, November 2024, the conference was in Berkeley, California. And I headed over there to attend the session and to host a challenge session on what are the pathways to open data as we start to see, data has always been an extremely valuable asset from the digitization of our industries. But as we see generative AI and AI agents becoming much more mainstream and much more a part of a business's workflow, we see this need for data, and not just an organization's internal data, but a triangulation of external third-party data. And so we wanted to ask the question, why is open data valuable? How do we build greater open data ecosystems? And as a community of open source individuals, we feel that this open data component is a really important area for the Linux Foundation to tackle. And, we're known as being an open source in terms of open code, but how can we also expand our efforts in open data? And so this challenge session was an opportunity to ask the World Open Innovation Community, working on the ground in this topic, how do we better capture the problems in this area and build out solutions at the Linux Foundation? And so that was the genesis of this report.
And when we use the term open, it can be confusing because a lot of folks use the term open that actually doesn't mean open in terms of open source that we talk about. So if I ask you, what is considered open data here?
Yeah, so we wanted to make sure that we were clear on what our definition was. So my co-author and I, Paul Wiegman, we were very clear at the start of the report that when we talk about open data, we're looking back at the roots of this concept in open science. And so originally you're looking at non-personal and non-commercial data that is freely published for the purpose of greater innovation and transparency and collaboration. And so specifically, we wanted to define it, or we chose to define it as open data as the data infrastructure that has technical and legal requirements in place to make it freely accessible, so that anyone can use, reuse, or redistribute that data. So sounding kind of similar to how we describe open source code, but that technical legal requirement is important. And so we also, because we were talking to an open innovation group, we thought about, from a wider context, what does openness mean? And so we wanted to explore it just beyond the data center definition. So we also discussed openness in the context of open standards, and kind of having that access to and control over the development of something, as well as the cost of its use and the completeness of that artifact, such as data or a standard, and finally how to share that artifact and collaborate around it with competitors or other individuals in a group. And so it's really around that, having the technical as well as the legal ability to have freely accessible data.
And for a very long time, we used to say that data is a new oil. I think it's a new solar or whatever you want to call it. But we live in a data-driven world. Apps can come and go. Data is where the real value is, and especially when we live in this LLM world, it has even more value. But when you were at the conference and you talked to a lot of folks, uh, why is open data more important now than it was earlier?
As you say, data was kind of the new gold or new, the new incredibly valuable asset in this space. As our industry is digitized, it became very important for data-driven insights on business decisions, knowledge around customers, and from a marketing perspective, a research and development. If you're looking in healthcare and having data to act to better develop drugs and pharmaceuticals, and then also and such as in the financial services industry, having data to complete regulatory and compliance activities like KYC, know your customer, and anti-money laundering activities. And so having this data becomes really important, and not just within organizational data, but as I mentioned earlier, that kind of ability to triangulate with external sources. And so because this data is so valuable, companies start to mediate its access to be able to control that value and maintain a competitive advantage, or from another perspective, to make sure they're compliant with regulation around personally identifiable information. And so data then becomes a value that, it becomes something that needs to be protected to maintain that privacy and that advantage. And so we see a lot of data that is really heavily siloed within institutions and very difficult to access to gain these insights. And organizations trying to access this data encounter technical, legal, economic, and even cultural obstacles to sharing data. And so as we move into this more mainstream, widespread adoption of AI, the ability to train these models rests on access to data, and organizations are currently having to rely on their own data. But as we start to build out these models, in order for them to be rigorous and sustainable and robust, we need the training of these models rests on access to data from external parties. And so that was really, as I mentioned earlier, that was really part of the impetus of having this challenge session, and looking at how do we build out an open data ecosystem that helps support this great need for data that is still using data that is legally available for LLM training and other AI needs.
The political landscape has changed so much since the session happened, the elections here and other parts of the world, uh, uh, which also means the way we look at data is also different now because of the whole legal framework that we are working or changing here. Uh, that is one factor that remains there either way. And Europe is very, very active when it comes to privacy. They have a lot of regulations there. Here in California also they have some regulations. Other part of the world also have their. But if just for a second forget about the legal challenges, legal requirements, what were some of the other key challenges? You did mention some of those, but that participant discussed that, hey, these are their pain points.
We worked with the individuals in the session to come up with the different challenges that they face and what we're hearing about, whether within their actual workplaces or what we're hearing about in the news or other environments. And so the part of the challenge of opening up data is due to the fact that data is very unique. We can't compare it oranges to oranges to software, and so data has complications such as the many different licenses that you have to navigate to use a data set. The other unique challenge of data is the scale and the cost of collecting and hosting this data, and also maintaining that, the fact that data is a malleable artifact that has to be updated consistently. Um, we need those workflows to maintain a data set in a different way than we need for maintaining software. And then the accuracy and quality of data becomes more complex, particularly when we look at personally identifiable information. If we have a data set that has incorrect information, for example, an individual's healthcare diagnosis that could be a fatally wrong or a fatal error in that data set, that accuracy and quality becomes really important. Um, and so some of the challenges that our session participants discussed was particularly that trade-off between the cost of maintaining such a valuable asset of a data set, requires significant curation and human resources. And so an open data set is often developed in a kind of a volunteer capacity. And so at least from the perspective of our participants, open data sets, there was a risk of it being less valuable, less accurate, and less curated. And so without the funds to curate, some of the participants preferred using closed data sets because of the quality of that data. Um, and also the lack of standardization of open data sets. As I mentioned, data privacy is a huge risk in this space. And so there is a risk aversion to opening up a data set, whether it's from a legal perspective of an individual in a legal department of a company saying, we can't open up our data. There's too much risk involved. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, the competitive advantage is considered a huge part of maintaining control over a data set. And so those are kind of the main challenges in data. And so you can see you have these technical obstacles, you have kind of cultural and economic concerns around maintaining a profit advantage. You have the kind of regulatory and compliance concerns that all come together to make opening up data quite complicated.
As you were earlier also talking about, when it comes to challenges related to data, and you also touched briefly on legal aspect as well, what you can or cannot use. The whole Creative Commons license, a lot of permissive license or restricted license were created to ensure that whatever you put on, just because something is on the internet doesn't mean it is fair play. Anybody can come and use it. But some of these LLMs, these companies, they don't respect that. But beyond that, when it comes to some of these challenges, what role does regional regulation play? Is it like when it comes to Europe or Asia or North America, Central America, South America, China, Japan? Did participant also mention that, hey, it's better there, we should follow this model here as well, or it's like it's very challenging to have any kind of data in that region? I just want to understand the impact of data on regional location regulations, and of course how people look at data.
Yeah, I think so a lot of our participants were European. The World Open Innovation Community is I don't know, primarily European, but there's a good representation of Europeans. And we talked a lot about GDPR, of course, and the idea that the regulation that is technically European is kind of more of a global one, as our digital world is lacks the boundaries to maintain that regulatory uh, boundary. But I mean the conversations were also focused on more of a global perspective in our discussions of solutions and challenges. I think I know from the research I've done in that more the healthcare space, uh, the European Commission and the EU are well set up to have more of a standardized solution around data. We see a lot more openness and open source usage in the healthcare space, and that kind of standardization or that collectivity around standardizing data, at least in the healthcare space, seems more prominent in Europe. And so not necessarily in this report, but as we've seen in our research at the Linux Foundation, there's a sense that there's greater greater collaboration around a standard in Europe than we're seeing, particularly in the US and in Canada, around that standardization of healthcare data.
Now, can you also talk about what are some of the solutions or pathways forward when it comes to these challenges?
Yeah, so we discussed the second half of the session was kind of more around solutions in this space, and we had some of our participants mentioned some of the things that they've worked on. One of which was a platform that they described, as you can see in the report, as a semi-open platform where different technically competitors come together under a platform or program. They share what we describe as pre-competitive data, so best practices, maybe some outcomes, some characteristics or aspects that don't reveal, maybe, for example, the names of a customer or a client. And so different groups can come together, understand these best practices and outcomes, and then build off of that in a competitive way. And so not all data is shared, but the data that can be shared is shared. And so that was one example. The other example that was discussed was in kind of more of the mapping space. And in the report, we gave a shout out to Overture Maps Foundation, which is a Linux Foundation project that creates reliable and interoperable open map data for different users and developers in the mapping space to be able to access these kind of standardized data sets, and they can share their data and combine data from different sources, and then use that data in a standardized way. And I think that some other some other things that came up more conceptually around solutions. One interesting one was, how do we rethink ownership of data? And so, as I mentioned earlier in this discussion, there's a large incentive for companies to mediate access to their data, and sometimes we think of companies as the owners of the data, but how can we kind of reframe that as the individual that the data is about is the owner, in a sense? And so rethinking, usage rights. So do we bring that individual back into that sharing process, and that individual gets to say, I'm happy to share this data with this group, but I'd rather not share my data in this capacity. And so, can we create systems that better serve the individual whose name is on that data set, or on that piece of data, and in that sense, the possibility of looking at open data more as a value add, as opposed to keeping that data closed off and proprietary. And so, the positive externalities of sharing data around innovation and research, and thinking about the healthcare sector, faster and more tailored outcomes in healthcare, creates this kind of altruistic cycle of wanting to share data. And then also, from a business perspective, incentivizing collaboration around this pre-competitive data set by understanding as I meant, those positive externalities of different collaborators sharing data, such as the semi-open example that I gave earlier. And then finally, how do we rethink a governance structure? These open data sets can kind of float around and not necessarily have a strong governance structure. And so building out a neutral body that can host this data set, manage the access to it and the security of it, and kind of create that structure around the data set. These were kind of these different conceptual ideas that came up around kind of rethinking what data actually, or the structure of data, and its governance and its incentivization and its ownership.
Anna, thank you so much for joining me today, and of course, go deeper into this report. Thank you so much for sharing these findings, and I look forward to chatting with you again. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Nice to chat with you.